Does the Bible allude to modern science? I just want to say to those of you that may have heard me in other eAcademy presentations, this is going to be a little bit different kind of presentation. Most of the time when I do presentations, they relate to how to study the Bible or how to get into the Bible or how to use accordance to study the Bible. This is going to be more of a focus on a subject that really is quite popular today. How does the Bible allude to modern science? Or does the Bible allude to modern science? Science, as most of you know, has a huge amount of authority, especially in the Western world. And many times people say that, well, if the Bible is the truth, God, or has a long heritage, how can that relate to modern science? And if so, is there any correlation? Now, I'm not going to go into the areas that are most popularly thought of when they talk about Bible and science, such as creation, evolution, and things like that. I'm going to talk about much more fundamental issues that maybe perhaps a better way of saying it is, does the way of thinking in the Bible point to modern science? So we'll go ahead and get into this and try to answer the question, does the Bible allude or does it point to modern science? And I have to admit a prejudice here before we get started. My background is actually physics and engineering, electrical engineering. And so when I talk about science here, I'm going to primarily focus on physics, which really is the most basic of all sciences. I would argue chemistry, biology, and other things sort of are more derivative sciences, and physics deals more with the absolute fundamental properties and laws of nature. And that's what we'll be focusing on here most of all. So let's look first at exegetical considerations because before one can get into the subject of the Bible and science, you have to understand, how are we going to interpret the Bible? Because a lot of, as you know, differing opinions on the Bible depends on how one interprets the Bible. And this is certainly no less true in the issue of trying to interpret the Bible in regard to modern science. So let me just go through the exegetical considerations that I'll be using here in this presentation. First of all, I'm going to be focusing on more what I call allusions of the Bible text. I'm not going to get into debatable things of exegesis or interpretation. And certainly one can have differing opinions on exegesis and interpretation, but I just want to look at what is the Bible sort of alluding to or pointing to, regardless of the exact interpretation or exegesis. Secondly, I want to mention that poetry can be very subjective. And I might remind you that, especially in the Old Testament, a huge section of the Bible is written in poetry, not in prose. But just because it's written in poetry, and just because poetry can be very subjective, I believe it can still be used as a legitimate resource. Even if poetic language is used, and certainly there is a lot of it there, that still it points to reality behind the poetry. And I think that it is a legitimate resource to use that may point to modern science. I also got to recognize that science itself can change, or at least scientific understanding. I wouldn't say that nature changes, but our understanding of nature can change. And so we've got to be careful when we try to fit the Bible in modern science, because if we try too hard to fit the Bible into science, and then science, or at least scientific understanding, changes, then what are we left with? Now we're going to say that the Bible doesn't support because science changed its mind. And so we have to be really careful also on this, because science is always an almost non-ending process of trying to understand nature by observation, hypotheses, and theories, and so forth. And we have to be very cautious to say what is, can we reasonably point that's basic to science of any time versus what is something that's here today and maybe gone tomorrow. Also, I want to recognize in exegesis that our own view of the world can influence our understanding of the Bible. And this is a very, very important point to say. The Bible is written with a viewpoint of the world that is quite different than ours today. It was written with a viewpoint of the world in antiquity. And what they may or may not have seen in antiquity, um, we have to be cautious in not imposing our views of the Bible in that. And I'll give you a classic example is there are verses that describe sunrise or sunset. Do these verses indicate a earth-centered sky or a sun-centered sky? And one example that I give here is Psalm 113:3. From the rising of the sun to its setting, the name of the Lord is to be praised. Okay, he's talking about the rising of the sun to its setting. This is something we see every day from our perspective on earth when we see the sunrise and sunset. But can we use this verse to assume that the earth is the center of all creation geometrically? Now I have to be careful how I word that. It may be the center in other ways. Or is the sun at least the local center of the close objects that we can observe, like the sun, moon, and the planets, and so on? And so that's something where in antiquity, many people saw this as a proof text that the sun goes around the earth. We would just say today, even most conservative believers would say that this is simply a phenomenological thing, that he's describing how he observes the sun from the earth. There's another verse that mentions corners of the earth. Do these corners indicate a flat earth or a round earth? Or do they even indicate earth at all? It may be an area of land. For example, in Isaiah 11:12, it says, he will gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. Well, first of all, you have several exegetical questions here. If you look in the original Hebrew, and we will be doing that more in the later verses. First of all, the word corners is really not a corner in like a corner of a room. It's more like a extension or edge, or even it's actually related to the word like the edge of a wing. And then secondly, even though modern translations say earth, it's really the same word for land, the land that they would see. They weren't necessarily talking about planet Earth. So again, do we draw a conclusion that they were talking about a flat earth as we understand flat today, or are they talking about simply from their perspective of the area around them, which they would perceive as flat, and or were they even using poetic languages? Perhaps some people have suggested the four corners represent the 4 points of a compass, like north, south, east, and west, and so forth. So we do have to be careful here, as that we don't impose our own views whenever we come up with a conclusion as to what the Bible says. Now I want to address the question of, does science change? Because this is very important. If science changes, we almost then have to be very, very careful in saying whether the Bible points to science or not. First of all, I would say scientific understanding, almost by definition, continually changes. This is the nature of scientific discovery. As you learn more and more, your understanding of nature can change. But does that mean that science itself is totally proven wrong and it's going to be something else totally differently? And one example of that, again, is in physics, is that physics was completely revolutionized by the discovery of the theory of relativity and by the development of quantum mechanics in the early 20th century. And what's really interesting is, at the end of the 19th century, many serious scientists, they seriously thought there's nothing more to discover in physics except to improve the measurement accuracy of the experiments, and that was about it. But they were totally wrong that physics was completely revolutionized. But does that mean that all the physics that scientists knew at the end of the 19th century was totally wrong? No, and I'll get to that in just a second. And so my point here is that many times science is not really wrong, but rather it is better understood. Now, I do want to say that there were things that science was wrong on, and I'm not, I don't want to say it was right on everything. For example, the existence of plasticine was considered a material in the 18th century and maybe into the 19th that science believed in, but now nobody would say it exists. It has to do with the chemical reactions and so forth. And then another thing is the existence of ether. Many scientists in the 19th century thought that there was such a medium as ether because you needed a medium for light to propagate. But now almost nobody accepts the view that there's an ether out there that propagates light. And another example of this is Copernicus. Prior to Copernicus, the scientific understanding was that the sun revolved around the earth. But today, we understand the opposite. But we have to remember the sun still appears to revolve around the earth. So that hasn't changed. It's what is our understanding of this phenomena that has changed. Another example is Einstein's special theory of relativity. I mentioned earlier that the early 20th century completely overturned modern physics, and this was one of the ways that it did it, was the special theory of relativity. But Newton's laws of motion that were developed in the 17th century by Isaac Newton have not changed. They're still used all the time. But so what it's happened is Newton's laws are not wrong. What has happened is we found that Newton's laws do not apply when you're at extreme velocities near the speed of light. But for most situations, especially anything in our normal scale, you're nowhere near the speed of light, and so Newton's laws are quite accurate. Now here I want to summarize some of the questions we want to consider as we deal with this subject of science in the Bible. First of all, does the biblical emphasis on faith contradict the importance of knowledge in the natural sciences? That's one question that comes up again and again. A second one is, what's the relationship of the God of the Bible to nature as we understand both in the Bible and in natural science? Another question is, does the Bible support the idea of consistency and permanence of the laws of nature? Because this is sort of a fundamental assumption of modern science. And secondly, does the Bible and natural science point to limitations of nature and about knowledge about nature? So these are the kinds of questions we want to consider as we look at both the Bible and modern science together on this stuff. So let's first deal with the question about faith and knowledge. On the one hand, faith is very important in any kind of relationship of God in the Bible. The Bible talks again and again about the importance of faith. And in fact, Hebrews 11:3 or 11:6 rather goes even further and says, without faith it is impossible to please him, that is God, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and he rewards those who seek him. So here the author of the book of Hebrews is emphasizing how very, very important faith is, and then he spends the rest of the chapter talking about examples of faith from the Old Testament. And here I put it in Greek. If you know Greek, you could see the word pistuos and pistuosai and so forth. Even in this verse, it's used the same root several times here. So faith is very important. But on the other hand, we also have to read other parts of the Bible that encourage us to observe nature and to learn about nature. And one of the most famous verses, I might add, is Psalm 19:1 and 2. That this is poetry, but yet it's speaking a really interesting truth. It says, the heavens declare the glory of God. The sky above proclaims his handiwork. And this is poetry because it's really rhyming the thought, saying the same thing twice. Heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. And then it even goes further and develops this further. Day to day pours out speech. Now what they say later on in the next verse 3 is it's speech without words. And night to night reveals knowledge. So they say very clearly that God reveals knowledge in nature, and God reveals something about his attributes, about the glory of God. And this is, I could read it in Hebrew, it's even clearer in Hebrew, but this is very clear now. One another verse I might mention, which I don't have here, is Romans 1:20, which also says a similar thing in a different context. It says that God has revealed his invisible attributes by observing nature that you can see. You can learn about God who you cannot see. And he does it in a different context to say that people that don't believe in God or don't believe in God's attributes have no excuse because they can look into nature and see many of the attributes of God, just like here in Psalm you can see the glory of God, which is one of his attributes. And I would add even many other things like his power and so forth. So the Bible does encourage us to observe nature. And in fact, in Genesis 3, Adam is even called to rule nature, and he's responsible for nature. And to be responsible, you have to learn about nature. So this whole concept of man's relationship with nature is repeated actually several times in the Bible. So, what do we conclude from all of this? Well, it's very clear that faith is very important in the Bible, especially in one's relationship to God. But on the other hand, as we noted, knowledge about nature is also encouraged, and it's also even commanded virtually as a testimony of God and his nature. So here's my conclusion, and I know there's differences of opinion on this, but here's my conclusion on the whole matter, that I don't believe they contradict each other. I would conclude, or at least safe to conclude, that knowledge about nature does support a reasonable faith. In other words, you just can't, faith doesn't mean believing in nothing or believing faith in faith, or faith is just shot in the dark. It's a faith that has a basis, a reasonable basis in nature that you can observe. It can even, this knowledge can even show attributes of God, but, and this is the big but, knowledge of nature alone cannot entirely replace the role of faith in God. And this is sort of the conclusion that I would reach from this, that nature is consistent with faith in God and how we understand, but it alone cannot replace entirely the role of faith in God. Now let's go more specifically into actual specific cases of how the Bible points to nature. And first, let's look at the relationship of God, because this is one of the foundation stones as we study the relationship of the Bible to science. What is the relationship of God to nature? First of all, the Bible makes it very clear that God is distinct from his natural creation. And again, Hebrews 11:3, which talks again about the issue of faith. But here the focus is not so much on faith, even though it's on the same chapter on faith. It says, by faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God. And the idea here is that what we see physically was created by something we don't see, namely the word of God. And then he interprets that and says, so that what is seen was not made out of things that were visible. And some translations might interpret it, but I think this is a better translation, that what is seen was made of that which is not unseen. And so even in the book of Hebrews, there's a clear distinction of God from his natural creation. Another case that we read about in the Old Testament is because nature is separate from God, nature has different properties from God. In Psalm 102:26, it says, they, that is the physical things, will perish, but you, God, will remain. They, the physical things, will all wear out like a garment. You, God, will change them like a robe. God is the one sovereign, but they will pass away. And you see this in Hebrew very, very clearly. You see here, hemo, yovedu, and that's the word, they will perish, they will go away. And then he says also, kabeged, yivlu, kalavush, like a cloth or garment, they will wear out. These are just the literal words from the Hebrew. There's no interpretation here. Like something that you wear out, that you wear. Okay, and then even in the New Testament, we have this clear distinction of what is physical and what is spiritual. In 1 Corinthians 15:40, Paul talks about their heavenly bodies and earthly bodies, but the glory of the heavenly is one kind and the glory of the earthly is another. And again, Paul is very clearly distinguishing in this letter between that which is heavenly and belongs to God and that which is earthly and the things that we see in the creation here. Now, what do we conclude on this idea of relationship of God to nature? First of all, by definition, even when we approach the whole issue of studying, we call these two different things. Science, or at least I should say natural science, is a study of nature. Now, I know people use science and other things like political science and social science, but I'm mainly talking about natural science here, which by definition is a study of nature, while theology is a study of God. And we really are talking about two different domains here. But I would maintain without the distinction of nature and God, science as we know it would be fundamentally different. If we did not distinguish nature and God, we'd have something closer to what theologians call pantheism, that is, God is everywhere in nature, or even animism, that there's animistic spirits in the nature around us. And if you assume animism or pantheism, you've got a lot of problems. First of all, you sort of assume the existence of magic, that things can just suddenly change without any reason, and it's hard to do science whenever you do that. Or you could say that, well, if God is nature, I'm intruding on his private domain, his private divine domain. That's the word I'm looking for, divine domain. And that it's forbidden for me to study God like I study science. But because nature and the study of nature from science is distinct from God, we're free to do this kind of thing. Now, I want to remind you that God can do whatever he wants, almost by definition, just about. And the Bible does talk about interventions in nature, and some people would call this miracles in nature. God can certainly intervene in nature, but I might add that it's occasional. And this intervention, though, would really be beyond the scope of natural science, because if God intervenes, you really can't repeat the experiment. You can't really study it in detail because it was just a short time, rare intervention. And I would maintain that that kind of thing is beyond the scope of natural science. Now, I recognize that our big problem here is we don't know always when God is intervening or whether he's just simply using natural law in a certain way. And that's sort of a theological and philosophical question that I don't want to get into. But my point is, if you believe that God intervenes in a way that would counter the laws of nature, that's really beyond the scope of natural science. Now, I might also mention that there are other non-Christian beliefs and philosophies that don't share this clear distinction of God and nature. And I already named a couple of them, of pantheism and animism. But even other beliefs, I would argue, have not fully been able to develop natural science as we do it because they did not share the fundamental assumptions that the Bible gives on how to approach nature. And so I would maintain that even if, for example, the early Greeks, in a classical era, there were some brilliant thinkers and they did observe nature, but they didn't have the same perspective on it. And so even though they were smart and they certainly taught us some things, they did not really develop science in the modern sense of the word. Now, as we look specifically at scientific phenomena in the Bible, I have to be very, very cautious here. I'm just going to name a couple of simple examples, but I recognize the fact that there are issues of interpretation, and I'll just leave it. But I want to just give a couple of simple examples now to show you that this really will not be the main focus of what I'm going to be doing. I want to look at things that are much more foundational, but I will give that there are simple examples that do seem to fit what we understand today in science. For example, the void of space. The book of Job mentions in Job 26:7 that he hangs the earth on nothing. This is really what it says literally in Hebrew. Tole eretz. Now you could argue that eretz is he hangs the land on nothing rather than the earth as we understand it. And then it says al bli ma, upon that which has nothing. Something like that. It's an unusual expression in Hebrew, but it's a very unusual phrase because he's trying to express a very unusual thought here. Another thing which seems to correlate with modern science is the bound Pleiades star cluster. Pleiades are a group of stars. They're sometimes called the seven sisters that we observe in the sky, and it says that they're bound. In Job 38:31, he says, can you bind the chains of the Pleiades? And then again, he uses rather rare words here, such as ma'adanot, which is binding, and kima, which is Pleiades. And some of these words are pretty rare, but the Hebrew lexicons say that these are the meanings of the word. Kima does refer to Pleiades, and also Job talks about other constellations like Orion that we also know today. But I think it's very remarkable that he asks about the Pleiades. That they even observed at that time that that was a bound star cluster. Now let's go back and deal with more fundamental issues related to the Bible and science. And this is the issue of consistency in nature. This is very, very important because without consistency, you can't do science. First of all, God does not change. In Malachi 3:6, it says it very literally, for I, the Lord, do not change. It's pretty clear there. And in the New Testament, in James 1:17, it talks about the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. God is called the Father of lights, probably a reference that he created the lights in the heavens, but then it says there's shadows with these lights, but the Father who made the lights, he has no variation or shadow due to change. So it seems pretty clear God does not change. God, in other verses, like God is the same today, yesterday, and tomorrow, and so on. But God does not change. But what's interesting is the Bible seems to indicate that nature and natural laws seem to be fixed. Isaiah gives a very profound verse in Isaiah 45:18. He says, for thus says the Lord who created the heavens, but then he adds, he didn't just create it. He was God who did it. He formed the earth, he made it, but he didn't just made it, he established it. And establishing it implies sort of a fixed law. And in particular, in the end of this, he says, Ve'oseh hu konena. And the Hebrew word konena implies that he laid it out, or established is probably a good translation. And that was part of what God did when he created the heavens and the earth. And Jeremiah 33:25 gives even perhaps clearer. It says, thus says the Lord, if I have not established my covenant with day and night and fixed order of heaven and earth. And what's interesting, he does say, if I have not, he's going to go on and say, if I had not done that, then I wouldn't keep this promise. But the focus of what we want to talk about is the last part, the fixed order of the heaven and earth. And this is exactly what it says here, chukot. And chukot is related to laws. It's the same word, chok is law, and it's related to the same word for laws. And he says, chukot shamaim ba'aretz, lo samti, have I not established at the end. And it's the same word in Hebrew. And this implies that he's established and set laws for even the creation. And the other thing that's interesting that the Bible says, and nature is also sustained by God. For example, in Job 5:10, it says very clearly, we can observe this today, that he gives rains on the earth and sends water on the fields. Well, that's sort of an observation you can make in nature. You know, we're sustained. Without all of these things like the rain and weather cycle, we could not live. But Colossians puts it even more profoundly and more basically. It says in Colossians 1:17, he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And this is very profound. All things hold together. That's just really profound. And when you think about it, nature is being held together because it's so easy that nature could change and be chaotic. And there are elements of chaos in nature, which I'll get to in a second. But as a whole, the natural laws hold together. And that's what I'm going to talk about in science, because there is consistency in natural science, and I again maintain that you cannot do science without consistency in nature. Now, nature is very complex. We certainly by no means know everything about nature, and we certainly acknowledge that there are things that we cannot explain in nature. But still, as a whole, the practice of science generally assumes natural law is consistent in time and space. That is, the laws of physics hold just as much on Earth as they do anywhere in outer space or even the universe. Now, I recognize there's a few areas of research going on with that, but generally, we've just observed again and again these fundamental basic laws are consistent in time and space. And here's just a very classic example of a natural law, the law of how much does something accelerate under the influence of gravity, and it shows a feather and an apple on that side. And normally you'd think a feather doesn't fall as fast as an apple, but that's because of the air resistance. But if you do it in a vacuum, they fall at exactly the same rate. And this is just a very simple or simplistic example of how a consistency of natural law. But then there's some other areas which are even much, much more profound than that. One of them, one of the most powerful, is what we call the fine tuning of physical constants. And what I'm talking about here are the physical constants used in physics, such as the speed of light, and there's the exact number. And then the other, which is a little harder to understand, is Planck's constant, which is a constant used in quantum mechanics that is very, very crucial to establishing the properties of atoms and things like that, and electromagnetic radiation and so on. But anyway, the point I want to make here, though, with these two constants, and there's, by the way, many others, this is just two examples of them. These constants and others like them determine the physical properties of nature. In other words, what we observe in nature and what are the properties of forces in nature, like gravity or nuclear force or electromagnetic force. The properties of those forces are determined by these constants, and if these constants change, the properties will change. But what's interesting is that scientists have discovered recently, it's not just the properties will change, the properties will change catastrophically. That without the exact values of these and other physical constants, the universe as we know it cannot exist. And that's the scare. And what we're talking about is the speed of light. If it even changes 1 part per billion or 1 part per trillion, that will have profound consequences on the properties of particles, the properties of atoms, the properties of molecules, the properties of elements. It'll all change. And the universe as we know it cannot exist. Now, maybe it could exist, but it would look totally different, and possibly even life itself could not exist. This is what we mean by consistency. That these constants are absolutely fixed, and if they're changed at all, they'll have great consequences to nature as we observe it. But what's good about this consistency is another thing that people don't realize. It's not just doing science, but human design, and I'm talking about mainly engineering here. Human design can harness this consistency to produce effects that are greater than the sum of the parts. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. For example, a tuning fork. If you know what a tuning fork is, it puts out a sound in an exact frequency. Well, is that a tuning fork, or is it just a hunk of metal, a piece of metal? Well, it's both, really, because the tuning fork is made of metal, and there's a reason for that because of the properties of metal, but also the exact design of the metal, the length of the tuning fork in particular, determines the properties of what frequency it will set. And the very fact that it even has a set frequency is because we designed this hunk of metal to be a specific specified frequency, and that's what gave it the property. Metal can't produce resonance or a sound if it's just simply a blob of metal, but you can design it like a tuning fork and then it will. Here's another example, an electric motor. Is this an electric motor, or is it just simply a pile of wire and metal? Well, electric motor is made of metal, it is made of wire, but the wire and the metal have to be designed exactly right. And there's a lot of engineering that goes into making an efficient electric motor so that you can produce and convert electricity to electromechanical motion. You just can't throw the wire and the metal in a pile and expect it to go together. But without the consistency of nature, We could not harness the properties of nature to produce these very specified effects, such as electromechanical motion. Now, another very interesting example in science and in the Bible is the relationship of nature to time. The Bible makes it very clear that God's time is different from our time. A classic example is Psalm 94. For 1,000 years in your sight are as yesterday when it is past, or watch in the night. He's comparing, and you can say this is poetry, but that doesn't change the point of it. Doesn't matter if you say 10,000 years in your sight or as yesterday. The point of it is that God's time different from our time, however you want to word it. And then even in the New Testament, in 2 Peter 3:8, it says, do not overlook this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord, one day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years one day. Now, how does this connect to science? Well, it actually does. Special relativity today in modern science shows that one day could be 1,000 years. Now, I grant you, this is not saying that, this is only in nature. The Bible said to God, one day is 1,000 years. But still, my point here is with special relativity, we have demonstrated experimentally that if an object goes 99.99999, I think there's 9 nines there, 6% of the speed of light, and this is the equation they use here, that indeed, from the perspective of the person looking at that object, that I have to go 1,000 years to equal one day in that object. In other words, our frames of reference are different. To the person that's going that fast, if I'm looking at him, he's going to age very, very slowly because time is slowed down to the point where the point that I have to go 1,000 years to be a day for him. Also, in this phenomenon you may have heard of black holes, and just very briefly, a black hole, even though it's used in the popular language now, but in physics and science, it's a concentration of matter that is so dense that even light cannot resist the pull of gravity. The gravity is just so strong. And here's an artist's conception of a black hole, even though they have now experimentally observed black holes. But the point of this is that we've also found that time changes with gravitational field. And if the gravity gets stronger and stronger, time slows down. And so again, time, and some people say in the presence of a black hole, time may even stop. So again, you have these phenomena in nature that show that what the Bible says about the relationship of time to God is not so crazy, that time is not absolute, even in nature, and it certainly isn't with God. Now, what about limits to natural and scientific law? Does the Bible talk about limits? First of all, the Bible makes it very clear that creation has time limits. You use the same verse, Psalm 102:26, that we did earlier. It says, the creation will perish. God is eternal. They wear out like a garment, and so on. They'll pass away. Makes it very clear that creation, anything material, has its limits. And another interesting example in the New Testament, in the Gospel of John, chapter 4:13 and 14, when Jesus met the woman at the well, he said, everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty. And here again, Jesus, even though he didn't intend this in a science sense, saying the physical water will make you'll be thirsty again. You'll be okay, but it's only a time limited. You'll need some more water later on when you get thirsty. But eternal water, you will never be thirsty again. Again, he's drawing the contrast between that which is material and that which is eternal, and that which is material has time limits. I might even add that the Bible says creation has spatial limits. The creation is not infinite. It says here in the prayer of Solomon, who was the wise king of Israel, he built the first temple and then dedicated it and prayed. And this is a verse from his prayer in 1 Kings 8:27. He said, will God indeed dwell on the earth? Because this was the temple where that they built as God's house, and he even calls it a house here. Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. how much less this house I built. Solomon realized, even though he was commanded to build a temple and so on, that he realized, and it was supposed to be the house of God, but he realized this house isn't going to contain God. God is bigger than the house and even bigger than the creation. Solomon knew that, but he still asked the question, because God, you're so big, how can you dwell on earth? Very, very profound verse here in 1 Kings 8:27. So what does science say about limits? Well, first of all of us know intuitively that anything material has simple engineering limits. And I'll give you a couple of examples here. Electrical example, here's a sine wave that you might see in an electrical signal in an amplifier, for example. Here's a mechanical object. This is an egg that's very nice, symmetric, and oval shape. And these are very nice objects here that you can say, yes, we can hear music, we can eat the egg or whatever. But then if you force it too much in an amplifier, you get what's known as clipping, that the amplifier has limits. It can only go so far. It'll distort otherwise if you push it too far. And likewise, mechanical, even though this is a silly example, this is exactly what happens. If you push the egg out of its limits, it'll break. And so everything has its limits, and this is just a very simple mechanic. Even the strongest steel and diamond has its limits, but I'm using a simple everyday example here. Okay, but there's even limits in the laws of physics, not just in engineering stuff. For example, we talked about the theory of relativity earlier, that mass increases and length decreases as you approach the speed of light. And no material thing can get to the speed of light. It would be infinitely heavy if it did. Now, photons, which are the particles of light, do go the speed of light, but they don't have any rest mass. Okay, another example in our limited views is the classical view of the atom. We think of an atom like a miniature solar system with electrons going around the nucleus, but really quantum mechanics has shown us that the atom is really much more a probability distribution. You cannot pick the point where the electrons are. They have certain kinds of standing waves around the atom, and all you can map is just a probability of where you're likely to find the electron around the atom. And similarly, there's even limits of knowledge about God and nature. We looked at physical limits in nature itself, but there's even, I would maintain, limits of knowledge. And this is what the Bible says. Can you find out the deep things of God? This is in Job 11:7. Can you find out the limit of the Almighty? He's challenging. Are you really going to know everything in nature or about God as far as that goes? And then Isaiah says it in a magnificent verse here, that for as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways and my thoughts than your thoughts. That we really have limits of knowledge. We are not God or gods. We have limits to our knowledge. There's no way. And then a proverb, which is sort of interesting here, that says similar thing. It is the glory of God to conceal things. We can't see it all, but the glory of the king is to search things out. Okay, to learn about nature. So that's what the Bible says. What about science? Are there limits of knowledge in science? And I recognize it's a little bit debatable. Some people believe science is unlimited, but I would point out that there definitely are limits, even that science itself shows. First of all, just about any scientific discovery raises additional questions, which implies that science may never understand all of science. Every time they answer a question, the answer just simply raises more question, and it's just a never-ending story. And even in physics, they talk about the ultimate force or something like that, the theory of everything. This was something popularized by Stephen Hawking and others, where they said, we want some theory that explains everything in nature. They still haven't gotten to that theory. There's still debates about it. They haven't gotten there. But I would maintain, even if they get there, I bet it will raise more questions. Science also cannot deal with questions that are legitimately part of our everyday experience, but they're not part of physical nature, such as what are values, what's right and wrong, what's purpose, why is something happening as it is. These are all questions related that science really is beyond, cannot answer these kind of questions. Science, even within science, on things you observe, it's limited in the prediction of what we call random or chaotic events. And a good example of that is a weather forecast. Weather forecasts will never be exact because we're dealing with a random event. In fact, some people call it the butterfly effect, where just some low-level noise will eventually affect something, and science cannot predict that. The most they can do is make generalization. Sure, you could predict the weather for the short term, but not for the very long term. Science also can measure exactly the half-life of radioactive materials, but quantum mechanics has shown us that the exact time of decay of an individual atom is truly random and unpredictable. There is no way in science to predict when an individual atom will decay, only when the group of them will statistically. And even science and quantum mechanics gave limits on our own measurements in science and simultaneously measuring the position of a particle and its momentum. The momentum is the mass times the velocity of a particle. This is called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Now, it's a very tiny effect. You don't see it in ordinary stuff every day, but what it's saying in this equation, delta x, delta p, the uncertainty of position and momentum, always has to be greater than h, which there's that Planck's constant again that we talked about earlier, over 4 pi. This is a fundamental limitation. If you measure the position exactly, you'll be very uncertain as to momentum. You measure the momentum exactly, you'll be very uncertain to the position. And this is a limit that is widely recognized in science. So, what do we conclude from all of these very fundamental things that we talked about in science? First of all, I want to conclude by not forgetting that there's still several potential problems that may occur when we relate the Bible to modern science, and we fully recognize that. There's exegetical difficulties, especially in poetry, the potential misuse of faith versus evidence. I personally do not believe in what's called the God of gaps, where if we don't understand something, then the only answer is God did it. Well, God did it. I'm not saying God didn't do it, but that's not really an answer from a science viewpoint. Maybe we can learn more about the phenomena that we don't understand. We just have to be cautious there. And also, I might add that there's a tentative nature of scientific discovery since the conclusions may change in the future. These are the dangers or potential problems we have. But nevertheless, despite these potential problems that occur, I can still conclude, or I would conclude, the Bible does point to modern science in several ways, and I'm just reviewing what we talked about. God is distinct from his creation, which provides the foundation for the development of modern science. Natural creation has different properties from God, which encourage research in modern science. We can't do that to a deity, but we can do it in science. The Bible itself provides several simple examples of observation in nature that we also see today in science. The Bible alludes to a consistency in nature and in natural law, which enables the development of science and engineering today. If we did not have this consistency, we couldn't do anything. Make anything. The Bible gives a perspective on time, which is actually more consistent with modern physics, and the fact that time is not absolute, but it depends on the environment. The Bible also describes various kinds of limitations in nature, which is also what we do observe those limitations in modern science. These limitations can be limitations in engineering design, they can be limitations in the extent of the laws of physics, or even potential limitations in our understanding of nature and science. Okay, well, this sort of concludes what we have to say. I want to thank you for your attention. I believe now we're going to have a time for any questions, and believe me, I do not have all the answers to this, but this is, I see, as sort of an introduction to the whole big issue of relating the Bible to science in a much more general way. Thank you.
Mark, do you want to take it?
Hello?
Hello, can you hear me?
I hear you.
Okay. I don't think we have, now somebody did ask Dr. Brown, you know, the presentation that this was created for, I guess we'll might as well just tell them it was for ETS. And
Evangelical
I don't think
Theological
it's going to
Society.
be available yet until November, correct?
Yes, they're not even presenting the papers until toward the end of November.
Yeah. So I do not know if ETS will even make this presentation available.
It probably will to the members, but not just to anybody.
Okay.
I apologize. I lost my audio, but I'm back now, and I can ask some of these questions I have written down here if you want, if you'd like.
Okay, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Here's the first one. Can the speed of light change? Some people say the speed of light was slower in past history.
Well, the thing is, to ask a question like that, you have to look at observation. And our best observation is no, it does not. I recognize that some people have postulated that the speed of light changed in the past, but the reason they did this was because they felt if the speed of light changed, then phenomena in nature would change to deal with the issue of time. I know why they asked it, but I don't want to really get into that here. But the thing is, there's no good evidence that the speed of light changes. It's been measured very, very accurately, both on Earth and in other places. We just have no experimental evidence right now that the speed of light changes. And the evidence that was used was based on a very early observation, mainly done in the 17th century, where they did a very crude measurement of the speed of light, but that had a lot of error to it. I mean, it wasn't bad for the 17th century, but now they have a much, much more accurate measurements, and we have not detected any change in the speed of light. And like I said, we've detected the opposite, that if the speed of light changed now, it would actually have extremely consequential changes to nature and what we observe in nature.
Great. A couple of questions about time. Is God in time or outside of time, or would it be better to say God transcends time and can enter time even though he is not bound by it?
That's more of a theological question, because to talk about time from science viewpoint, God is really beyond the scope of scientific investigation. This is why I made a big deal about the distinction of creation of nature from God, or creation from creator. But I would say God transcends time in a way that I don't think we, even now to this day, fully understand. You at best have history. We say that he's all-knowing. We say that he knows the future and all of this. This would suggest, although even that question, how much does he know the future, is sort of a theological debate people are going through now. But I would say in any case, God transcends time, and questions like this are very hard for us to imagine. What does it even mean to transcend time? I don't fully understand that. Now, yes, I can take measurements of clocks to show slowing of time like I did in relativity and so on, but to say you're transcending time, I don't fully understand that, and I don't think that's a question answerable in science.
A somewhat associated question is, how would you define time, or maybe how would physicists define time?
Physicists define time by measuring processes. Like, for example, well, the original definition of time is right in the Bible. Read Genesis 1. It says there, when God created the stars and the lights in heavens, he did it for a specific purpose, to mark seasons and times. He says that specifically, that's the purpose. So really, ultimately, time is a measurement of processes that we observe in nature that seem to be consistent. Like, for example, the time of a day, 24 hours. That's a way of measuring time. If we see that or of course, nowadays we measure time by the ticking of a mechanical clock, or you can use a quartz crystal, the resonance, which is even more accurate, or you can use atomic clocks, which measure time extremely accurately. But all of them are based upon measuring a physical phenomena that is reasonably consistent with itself, that repeats itself very accurately. That's how I would measure time.
That's great. Thank you. Here's another one. Is not science really a method of observation and testing? If so, science cannot really get off the ground without certain philosophical presuppositions. That being the case, does not the presuppositions brought into science by the scientists affect the conclusions they draw from their observation?
Okay, I sort of agree in general, but I'm not sure quite where the questioner was going with that question. have an idea, but I'm not sure. But I would say science absolutely is based on presuppositions. In fact, I even name them. Now, you can check out some of these presuppositions, like, for example, the consistency of the laws of nature, time and space. That is a presupposition. There's also a presupposition of consistency in nature. There's a presupposition that it's okay for us to do experiments in nature. All of those are presuppositions, which a few of them can be checked out, like consistency of laws, but many of them you have to start with presuppositions. And this actually addresses the point I was trying to make, that the Bible itself gave us the presuppositions that enabled us to develop science, which other philosophies and theologies didn't do. I mean, animism, I don't see how you can have science if you have an animistic belief in spirits and magic and so on. You cannot develop science. But the Bible gave us the presuppositions. I don't know what more to add to that. I agree with the questioner's assumption that yes, science has presuppositions.
Another question: have you heard of quantum entanglement, and what do you think of it?
I've heard of it, and I almost put it into this lecture, but I figured it'd be a little bit too weird and misunderstood. Quantum entanglement is very, very interesting, because quantum entanglement has to do with the fact that you can predict the phase of one particle based upon what you observe in another particle, even though their separation is at a distance that's and a time elapsed that violates the theory of relativity. In other words, it almost looks like you have instantaneous communication. Now, that is very, very interesting, but the problem with that is that that doesn't mean you can communicate or send information. It just simply is talking about an observation of one particle that you could predict what the other one will be based on that one, and even at that time, and they experimentally verified quantum entanglement. But as far as using it as a means of communication, that's still a little bit a little beyond science at this point. I'm not going to say never, but I believe the theory of relativity still limits the speed at which communication can propagate between parties. I don't think you can use quantum entanglement as a instantaneous, but I could be proved wrong, and I'd be happy to be proved wrong.
Great. Has the quantum understanding of individual atom decay changed the confidence in radiocarbon dating in geology?
Absolutely not, because the whole idea of radiocarbon dating, you don't look at individual atoms. You look at the aggregate decay of the carbon-14, and we know accurately the half-life of carbon-14, which is about 5,500 years, I believe. And we can look at the whole idea of carbon-14 is to compare it with another isotope called carbon-12, which does not decay, and looking at their ratios gives you an idea of the age of a particular piece of material, usually organic, that contains carbon, and that's the principle. But you don't look at individual atoms in carbon-14, you look at the aggregate of all of the carbon-14 atoms that are left, and the fewer that are left, the lower the decay will be, which means it's older. If it's more, and I don't want to go into more details than that, there's a lot of other details in carbon-14 dating, but you don't look at individual atoms. You can measure with quantum mechanics probabilities accurately. What's the half-life is a kind of probability. You can measure the probabilities of a position of a particle, but you cannot pin down the exact position without saying you don't know anything about its momentum. But I would say carbon-14 doesn't look at individual atoms, to give you the quick answer.
Trying to figure out how to structure this question, but with the the apparent millions or billions of light years away that observable bodies happen to be, would that say anything about the age of the universe?
Well, I guess that's the whole issue of age of the universe is an area which I know there's controversy among Christians on that. But I would say if you observe it that far away, the natural conclusion, if you observe it millions of light years away, the natural conclusion is that it is really that old. But that's all I want to say. There's a principle in science known as Occam's razor, which means that if you have competing scientific explanations, you tend to take the one that's the most simple and consistent with natural law. Let me pull this up again here. And for that reason, if it looks like it's that far away, it's probably reasonable to assume that it is that far away. Now, if you're going to use things like, was the light created on that way to make it look that far away, that's, to me, violating a little bit of Occam's razor. Yes, you can assume that, and it's theoretically possible. I mean, like you say, God can do anything, but then you get into other philosophical questions of observation of nature. Then you're basically saying, I'm being deceived. And so that would be my answer, and I don't want to talk any further about that. I would just simply say that, yes, I mean, we could observe even planets in our solar system, even within our galaxy. You know, in other words, there's multiple ways you can measure distance, and you could even measure distance by parallax, not by the speed of light, to see the distance of a body that's, I believe, more than what some people would think. You know, this body may be, you know, several tens or thousands. They're now able to even measure by parallax, which is a direct way of measuring distance and does not depend on, you know, it simply looks that way. It's that far away, and we see it. So why do we see it?
Great. Okay, you mentioned that animism and belief in magic would render scientific investigation unworkable. What would you say to someone who says that belief in God's divine intervention equates to the same sort of problem?
I already addressed that earlier, and I don't want to sound condescending. I'm sorry if I did, but I mentioned about the fact that God's intervention, there's two aspects of God's intervention. I mentioned that earlier, that it is rare, it's only very occasional. If God intervened all the time, I would agree with that person that you cannot do science. God. And secondly, I said it's beyond the scope of scientific investigation. I think it would be within the scope of historical investigation because there'd be forensic evidence of what happened. But it would be very hard to repeat an experiment or to do a consistent operation on something that just very rarely happened for a limited amount of time. And so I would say the difference is yes, God can occasionally, and I recognize there's differences of opinion among Christians on this. Some Christians feel God intervenes frequently, others, and even if you read in the scope of the Bible, how many times does God intervene in the, what would you say, 1,000 to 1,500 years, which is the scope of the Bible? You could probably count on one or two hands how many times over thousands of years. That means that there are many, many periods, even in the Bible, where God did not intervene, or at least didn't record intervening. And so I would say that the issue is one of degree. Animism says everything is magic and spirit, and whatever you look at is going to have a spirit behind it. That's not what the Bible says. The Bible says God created natural law, and when he does intervene, usually for a spiritual purpose, because he's trying to teach something, it's only very, very occasional and very limited, and I would add, beyond the scope of scientific investigation. That's the best answer I could give to that.
No, that's very good. And this question may be somewhat related. When Joshua requests the sun to stop, and indeed it does this observation have scientific explanation?
I can't think of a good scientific explanation, but the thing is, again, if you say that this was something that God, a phenomena that God did that countered natural law, then we can't really scientifically investigate it. And I've heard some people say, well, when the sun stood still, the earth stopped rotating. Well, it really doesn't say that. That's just your scientific inference from it. All it says is the sun, in fact, it even doesn't say stood still, it just said it stopped. Dome, I think, is the Hebrew word for it. It just stopped, you know. Now, I don't personally have a good scientific explanation of it, and it could be in the realm of something that clearly violated on a temporary basis natural law, but the problem in trying to explain it is you've got so many other consequences of that explanation. Let's say the earth stopped rotating. That would have enormous geological influences unless you now had another violation of natural law and the earth has no mass, so you can stop it rotating. Or if it's some phenomena like maybe he put a reflector up in the sky to make the sun look like it stopped still. But then what is the evidence for that? You know, there's just so many things in that, and I don't have a good explanation. Some people feel it's poetic, but I'll let the exegetes take care of that. Even if you don't consider it to be poetic, I don't have a good explanation what happened, and all I can say was this was something done that God intervened. It was prayed. Joshua prayed the prayer. He answered it in a way that I don't think I fully understand.
Excellent. Let's see. Why do you think the Bible describes the earth as having foundations or as being established by God? Is this strictly metaphorical or allegorical, etc.? Can you say more about this ancient Near Eastern viewpoint and how it can be reconciled or contrasted with modern science?
First of all, as I brought up an example about the four corners of the earth, you have to be very careful in interpreting. I have no problem with saying God established the foundations if we take foundation to be a much more, no pun intended, foundational thing. You know, like he established the creation, fundamentally established it. That's what they mean by foundation, fine. But what was the first part of that verse before foundation? They used another word.
Yeah, it was as was it the corners of the earth? Let's see, or as being established by God.
Okay. Well, again,
Yeah,
I mentioned you've got to be careful with the word earth, and I emphasized that earlier. There is no word. Well, I got to be careful. There's no word, but there's no usual word in Hebrew to describe earth in the way we understand planet Earth. The word earth is translated as the word Eretz, and Eretz can simply mean land or just the land around you. I mean, maybe it can include the entire earth, but it's really not that clear, because then you have to start assuming modern 20th or 19th century, at least, observation of how we understand the earth today. At that time, he just simply said four corners of the land. Could have been the land of Israel, could have been the land of this empire that he was referring to. And so I don't see any reason to read into that a flat earth view. And plus the flat earth view, even though I know there's people that take it seriously today, and I'm not going to ridicule them, but the flat earth view has virtually no scientific evidence for it today, just in so many ways. Sure, if I just look out on the horizon, it looks flat. So you could say, well, what I observe. And yes, it does appear flat. And if you want to say that's what I mean by a flat earth because it appears flat, fine. But even the early Greeks realized through experimental evidence that the earth wasn't flat. They measured the shadow in Alexandria versus Athens to determine the rough idea, the diameter of the earth, which wasn't bad for that time. And also, those with very good eyes actually noticed that ships approaching, they would see their mast first before they saw the body of the ship, which also, so the Greeks weren't stupid. They realized in some way the earth was round. And I think we're reading too much into it to say, because we talk about the ends of the land, which is a more literal translation, or even the wingtips of the land, that that's assuming a flat earth.
Thank you. And just, this is my question. Would you, when the Bible talks about the firmament, would you, hold that in the same kind of category?
Actually, the firmament's an easy one. I know that it's got a very debatable translation. Firmament comes from the Latin Vulgate, from Latin firmamente, because they didn't know what firmament was. It's a word rakia in Hebrew, but the best way to understand firmament, in my opinion, is look how it is used in parallel. And that I believe that verse in Psalm 19 that I quoted in verse 1 actually uses the word parallel with heavens. And even in Genesis 1, it's understood. I would personally, if it were me, I would translate firmament as just another word for heavens and translate it as sky. Okay, that's my own. I don't think you can read much more into that because it is used in parallel. And this is one of the ways we learn about what Hebrew words mean. If we look at the way it's used in parallel with the word heavens, which is shamayim. And that's how I would use the word rakia. And I would not establish anything crazy, and I would not necessarily read Middle Eastern mythology into all of this. You know, you can read it in if you want, but I don't think it requires that. And I recognize that there's even evangelicals that disagree with me on that, but I don't think it requires reading Middle Eastern mythology into the account.
Very good. And you've touched on this, but I do hear it's a question someone asked, and I hear this a lot. So here's the question. Who decides the age of any piece of carbon or the exactness of carbon dating? Who living today are able to state a piece of exact age? Surely no one living today can state the life of carbon absolutely.
Well, people are really obsessed with carbon-14. All it is just a measurement tool. It's not a theology. And I'm being a little sarcastic here, I know. But I'll tell you who determines it. It's the lab instruments that determine it. It's nobody determined. No person makes a judgment. I think this looks like it's 7,000 years old or something like that. It's the instruments. You send it to a laboratory, and they've done this with things even that we wouldn't have any controversy about, like things that are from the medieval period or even from Middle Antiquity, like from the Roman period we can date. And what they'll do is send it to 3 labs, maybe that have the instruments, and they'll say, we're not even going to tell you anything about this. Just go measure. Tell me how old it is by carbon dating. And usually all 3 labs will return a date that's very, very close, because carbon dating has been calibrated by things like tree rings and other means. And it's because, you know, there are assumptions in radioactive carbon dating, like the amount of radioactivity that the cosmic rays generate when it generates the carbon-14 atoms. That's done through cosmic rays. And there's a lot of assumptions, but they've really, through experience, worked through these, and you can really get a fairly accurate date. Now, I recognize there's things like contamination and all of that can enter into the picture, but it's no person does it. It's the instruments that do it.
Great, thank you. Question, so would you define a miracle as an intervention of God that suspends the laws of nature?
Boy, y'all are really putting me on the spot here. You're going a little beyond the scope of what I'm trying to do. I don't actually define a miracle like that, but this is just my opinion, and I know people will jump on me for this. I prefer a definition of a miracle as an extraordinary event that God supervises over to get the attention of the people that are seeing that event. That's how I define miracle, okay? I don't think we're capable of knowing exactly when God suspends nature and when God doesn't suspend natural law. Plus, we don't even know natural law. All we know about natural law is what science up till now has found. And I'm not saying the natural laws are wrong, but I am saying that there's things about natural law we still don't fully understand. And so what makes us even capable of that? And I don't think it really matters. If God is God, he's the God of intervention, he's the God of natural law. What difference does it make in the end? Sorry if I'm probably giving a very minority view on this, but this is the way I feel about it, having thought about it a lot, that I prefer to use a miracle as an extraordinary event that gets our attention because it is unusual, you know, whatever that event might be. And usually in the Bible, a miracle was there to teach a spiritual lesson or to perform an event, maybe to help the people of Israel, to save God's people or whatever. And that's the most we can say about it, that it's an extraordinary event that's there to teach us something about God.
Mark, before you go on to the next one, let me just make a couple of quick comments here. And we have a few questions left, and then we probably have to wrap this up. In your chat area, we do have the coupon codes, and that's self-explanatory. Mark, I can't remember, Mark Rooker. And if you can get that individual title, you just go to our website, you'll see it's on sale, or you can get all these 40 question series. But all that to say is a lot of the things that Dr. Brown is talking about is in some ways addressed within this book, you know, or terminology is given to address it. It's a really good overview on creation and evolution. So it almost covers some of the stuff that Dr. Brown has and addresses some of the questions that I see coming in on the question board here. So just thought I'd put that plug in there. Dr. Brown, if you want to say anything about that little booklet, or not a little book.
I haven't read the whole book, but I skimmed the contents and it looked very good. And I might mention that Dr. Keithley is going to be the chair of the session that I'll be doing where I'm presenting this paper. He and I actually set up a science and Christianity, or natural science and Christianity, or we're in the process of setting that up at ETS to address these kind of questions.
Mark,
thank you all.
I guess we got a couple more questions left.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions here that are, a couple of them might be outside the bounds of what you're covering and are more exegetical.
And by the way,
nature.
can I just make a somewhat sarcastic mark here? Today happens to be in Congress the vetting of a Supreme Court judge, and regardless of what your opinion is about her, that I feel a little bit in the same position right now. I feel like I'm being vetted a little bit. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, to make you feel probably better about that, Joseph Sollenberger, a longtime accordance user, and he's on the forum posts a lot. He says, Dr. Brown is exactly correct in his thinking of miracles as related to natural law, and that's coming from an old chemist. So, you got some affirmation there.
Thank you.
But and there are probably a lot of accordance users that would like to know this. How did you come to switch from physics and electrical engineering to biblical studies and the development of accordance?
That's a personal thing. I'll just do it in very general terms. That I've always had an interest, at least as an adult, even as a child, in the Bible. But professionally, I have degrees in physics, and it was sort of a morphing process. I went from physics, but I was much more interested in electronics, electrical engineering. I even as a teenager did a lot of electronics. And so I worked professionally in the area of electrical engineering, but as computers developed, more and more electrical engineering involves software development. So I really, in electrical engineering, I tended to go more into software development of simulation and modeling of phenomena in electrical engineering and modeling matching circuits and things like that. I don't want to get too technical here in this session. And then from there, I still had this interest in the Bible, and because personal computers were more available in the last, let's say, 20 to 40 years, actually 40 years now, it's been a long time, that sort of morphed into saying, because you couldn't do Bible software on a mainframe, that wasn't practical, or with punch cards if you really want to go back really in antiquity in computers. And so with the advent of the personal computer, where it was much more accessible to people, my having an interest in the Bible together with my background in software development led to the natural question of, should I do Bible software? And the other two advantages I felt I had, and I know it sounds a little arrogant to you, that I understood both the Bible and also the original language side. I have had a little bit of Greek and much more Hebrew, as you can tell, and I understood the programming side. And most people are either one or the other. Most scholars know their subjects brilliantly, of whatever persuasion a scholar might have, but many of them, not all of them, many of them have trouble just turning on the computer. Now that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but not much of one. And then most programmers that are not into the Bible or don't know original languages don't know really how to handle software from a biblical perspective. And I felt that this was something I thought I could contribute in. And it was a personal decision that I thought I could do both at the time. This was, and accordance has been around 25 years. This was a decision that I made in the early 90s. So I don't know if that's a brief answer on how you get from science to Bible software.
That's a great answer. And I think that wraps up the questions, and a lot of wonderful comments that people are posting. Thanking you so much for an excellent presentation. You're being called a treasure. Just want you to know.
A traitor?
A treasure, not a treasure.
Oh, I heard traitor.
No. Hey, Mark.
Translators are traitors, but you're a treasure.
Some people might think I'm a traitor.
There's one here that I think is, I see one here from a person I'd like to, because I think it's sort of interesting. You mentioned that scientific understanding can change. Some have referred to this as a paradigm shift. Do you think there is a scientific paradigm shift coming in some area of investigation?
Boy, that's an excellent question. And my initial answer is I don't know, but I do see hints of it, especially in quantum mechanics. There's weird stuff that goes on there. And maybe some of you have heard of quantum computers, which will solve problems that classical computers can't solve. And then also, one danger of science that I see, though, and this is sort of going the opposite direction, I'm afraid, and this is just a personal opinion, that science is losing its original foundations because of the paradigm shift on where scientists are going and using science and mixing science into areas that is not that scientific. And I'm not going to name specific examples because that would just get into more discussion. But I might remind you that almost all the early scientists were serious Christian believers. Galileo was persecuted by the church, but his beliefs about the Bible and science were very similar to most evangelicals today. The problem was that the church had established the viewpoint of Aristotle, Aristotelian, I guess you'd say, viewpoint of science, which wasn't quite correct. And Galileo was a true scientist. He said, well, let's look at what nature says. And he got in trouble for it. But he certainly was not an atheist or fought the church because of its theology. He simply said, this is what the science tells us. And all of these early scientists, Maxwell, who was a tremendous mathematician, set up the laws of electromagnetic radiation that we wouldn't have anything today in communication. He was a very serious Christian believer, and I could just go down the line. And so, but what concerns me is the paradigm shift that science is losing. It's people question things that, in my opinion, go against the science and the foundations of science. Like, for example, let's take the Big Bang. And I know this is controversial even among Christians, but because of the theological implications of the Big Bang, that there was a beginning, that time began and space began at a certain point, and you can debate the details, and those are still being developed. But because of the philosophical implications, many people can't accept that. So they ask, what was before the Big Bang? Or was there a multiverse? And questions like that really science can't fully answer. But they have to ask those questions because of the implications. They can't accept the implications of that there was a beginning, which is exactly what the Bible says, there was a beginning. And that's all I want to say about that. That's a whole subject in itself.